There's a god who's been misunderstood for over 3,000 years. A deity whose name has become synonymous with bloodshed, chaos, and mindless violence. When you hear the name Ares, you probably picture a brutish warrior, muscles rippling, eyes wild with battle fury, caring about nothing except the next fight, the next kill, the next war. That's what the stories tell us. That's what we've been taught to believe. But what if everything we think we know about Ares is wrong? What if the god of war never actually wanted war at all? Let me take you back to ancient Greece, to a time when gods walked among mortals, and the line between myth and reality blurred like morning mist over the Aegean Sea. Picture the great hall of Mount Olympus, where the divine family gathers. Zeus sits on his throne, radiating power and authority. Athena stands beside him, wise and calculating, her gray eyes sharp with strategy. Hera watches from her seat, regal and commanding. Apollo plays his lyre, bringing music to the celestial realm. And then there's Ares, standing apart, always apart. The one child Zeus never truly loved. The one god the Greeks themselves seem to despise. But here's where it gets interesting. The Greeks worshipped countless deities. They built magnificent temples to Zeus, to Athena, to Apollo, to Aphrodite. They held grand festivals, offered elaborate sacrifices, composed hymns and poetry celebrating their divine patrons. Yet for Ares, the god of war, in a civilization that was almost constantly at war, they built almost nothing. A handful of temples scattered across the entire Greek world, a few reluctant prayers whispered before battle. Why? If war was such a fundamental part of Greek life, if victory in combat was so valued, why did they treat the god of war like an unwanted guest at a family gathering? The answer lies not in what Ares represented, but in what he revealed about humanity itself. You see, the ancient Greeks were masters of psychological projection. Their gods weren't just divine beings to be worshipped, they were mirrors reflecting back the parts of human nature that people both recognized and feared. And Ares, more than any other god, reflected something the Greeks desperately wanted to deny about themselves. Think about it for a moment. When you imagine war, what comes to mind? Perhaps you think of honor, of valor, of soldiers fighting for their homeland, of strategic brilliance leading to glorious victory. That's the sanitized version of war. That's the story we tell ourselves to make sense of organized violence. The Greeks did the same thing. They had Athena for that narrative, the goddess of strategic warfare, of justified combat, of war with purpose and meaning. Athena represented war as it should be, war as a noble endeavor, war with clear moral lines and heroic outcomes. But Ares represented war as it actually is, the blood-soaked reality beneath the golden myths, the panic and terror, the random cruelty, the way violence strips away civilization and reduces human beings to screaming, desperate animals fighting for survival. Ares was the god of the battlefield at its worst, when all the pretty words and noble causes evaporate in the face of death's absolute finality. He was the embodiment of war's honest truth, and the Greeks hated him for it. Now, pause with me here and consider something strange. In Homer's Iliad, one of the foundational texts of Western civilization, there's a scene that reveals everything we need to know about how the Greeks viewed Ares. During the Trojan War, Ares himself descends to fight among the mortals. He joins the Trojan side, eager for battle, ready to demonstrate his power. And what happens? Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, literally guides a Greek spear to wound Ares. The god of war gets stabbed. He screams in pain and flees the battlefield, running back to Zeus to complain about his injury like a child crying to a parent. Zeus's response is chilling. He looks at his wounded son with contempt and says, essentially, "You are the most hateful of all gods. You love nothing but strife and violence. If you weren't my son, you'd be lower than the titans in the underworld." This is a father speaking to his child. This is the king of the gods rejecting his own offspring for embodying exactly what that offspring was created to represent. The cruelty is almost breathtaking. But here's the question that should haunt us. What does it mean when a civilization creates a god to represent war and then treats that god with universal contempt? What does it say about how we process violence and our own capacity for destruction? Let's go deeper. The mythology surrounding Ares is filled with fascinating contradictions that reveal layer upon layer of meaning. Ares was the son of Zeus and Hera, born from the king and queen of the gods themselves. Unlike Athena, who sprang fully formed from Zeus's head, or Dionysus, who had a complicated birth story, Ares was conceived and born naturally. He should have been the perfect prince of Olympus. Yet from the very beginning, the myths tell us he was unwanted, unloved, a source of embarrassment to his parents. Why? What had this infant god done to deserve such rejection? The answer is nothing. He had done nothing. His crime was simply existing as himself, embodying the raw, unfiltered reality of violence that his parents and the pantheon preferred to ignore or reshape into something more palatable. Ares was born to be a scapegoat, a divine repository for all the ugly aspects of war that the glory-seeking Greek culture wanted to disavow. And yet, despite all this rejection, despite being called the most hated god, despite being wounded and humiliated, Ares never gave up on seeking love and acceptance. This is where the story becomes truly heartbreaking, because Ares found love in the most unexpected place, with perhaps the most unexpected goddess, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Now, on the surface, this seems like an odd pairing. What would the goddess of love want with the god of war? But look closer. Aphrodite was married to Hephaestus, the god of the forge, a brilliant craftsman but physically disabled and considered ugly by divine standards. Hephaestus himself was another rejected child, thrown from Olympus by Hera because of his appearance. Aphrodite's marriage to him wasn't born from love, but from political arrangement. And Ares, the perpetually rejected warrior, found in Aphrodite someone who saw beyond the surface, beyond the reputation, to the god underneath. Their affair is one of the most famous in Greek mythology, and it's usually told as a scandalous tale of infidelity and lust. But read it differently. Read it as the story of two souls who understood rejection and loneliness, finding genuine connection with each other. Ares and Aphrodite had children together, Phobos and Deimos, fear and terror, but also harmonia, harmony. Think about that. The god of war and the goddess of love created harmony together. There's something profound in that symbolism, something that suggests even in the midst of violence and chaos, the possibility of peace and connection exists. The most famous story about their affair involves Hephaestus discovering their relationship and crafting an unbreakable net to trap them in bed together, then exposing them to all the gods of Olympus for mockery. The other gods laughed, they made jokes, they humiliated Ares once again. But even then, even caught and shamed before the entire pantheon, Ares stayed with Aphrodite. Their relationship continued because for perhaps the first time in his existence, Ares had found someone who didn't hate him for what he was. Let me shift the lens now and ask you to consider something that might change how you see not just Ares, but war itself. What if Ares wasn't the cause of war, but its consequence? What if this god, created to embody violence, was actually a victim of the very thing he represented? Think about soldiers returning from combat, carrying trauma that never fully heals. Think about how societies honor warriors in the abstract, but often abandon them when they come home changed, damaged, unable to fit back into civilian life. The veteran who can't sleep without nightmares. The fighter who learned it to survive through violence and now can't turn that instinct off. The person who did what their society asked of them, who went into hell because their community demanded it, and then came back to find themselves rejected, feared, isolated. That's Ares. That's what Ares represents in his truest form. He's not the instigator of war, he's the embodiment of what war does to those who experience it. He's the psychological and spiritual damage that combat inflicts. And just like modern societies that wave flags and offer hollow thanks while cutting funding for veteran services, the Greeks built grand narratives about glorious warfare while shunning the god who showed them war's real face. There's a particular myth that illustrates this perfectly, though it's less well known than the Iliad story. In Thebes, Ares had a sacred spring guarded by a dragon. When Cadmus, the founder of Thebes, arrived in the region, his men killed the dragon. Ares was furious. His sacred guardian had been slaughtered. In retribution, Cadmus had to serve Ares for 8 years. But here's what's fascinating. Those 8 years of service are described as a period of peace and learning for Cadmus. At the end of it, Ares gave his daughter Harmonia to Cadmus as a wife, and their wedding was attended by all the gods. It was one of the few times Ares received respect and honor from the pantheon. What does this tell us? When someone actually took the time to understand Ares, to serve him, to recognize what he represented, the result wasn't more violence. It was harmony. It was peace. It was integration. The lesson seems to be that ignoring or rejecting the reality of violence doesn't make it go away. It just makes it more dangerous. But acknowledging it, understanding it, integrating it into our consciousness in a healthy way, that's when we find balance. The Romans understood this better than the Greeks. When they adopted the Greek pantheon and renamed the gods, Ares became Mars. And Mars, while still a god of war, was treated completely differently. The Romans built grand temples to Mars. They honored him as one of their most important deities. They considered him the father of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome itself. Mars wasn't just a god of chaotic violence to the Romans. He was also a god of agriculture, of boundaries, of protecting the city and its people. Why the difference? Perhaps because Rome, unlike Greece, couldn't afford the luxury of pretending war was noble and strategic. Rome was built on constant expansion, on practical military power, on the honest acknowledgement that their empire existed because they were better at organized violence than their neighbors. They couldn't project their discomfort about war onto their war god and reject him because they needed him too much. They needed to honor the reality of what made their civilization possible. This brings us to a modern question that I think is crucial. How do we, today, in our current world, deal with the Ares within ourselves and our societies? Because make no mistake, Ares is still here. He's never left. He appears every time a nation goes to war, every time violence erupts in our communities, every time we feel that surge of anger that makes us want to lash out, to hurt, to destroy. Ares is the part of human nature we've been trying to civilize away for thousands of years, and yet he remains. We see him in the way we treat violence in our media. We make movies that glorify warfare, that turn combat into entertainment, that carefully edit out the real consequences of bullets and bombs. We play video games where we rack up kill counts without thought. We consume endless content about serial killers and true crime, fascinated by violence as long as it's kept at a safe distance. And then, when real violence touches our lives, when war comes to our doorstep, when we're forced to confront what we've been consuming as entertainment, we recoil. We're shocked. We claim we had no idea it would be like this. That's the same rejection the Greeks practiced with Ares. We want the sanitized version, the Athena version, where violence is strategic and purposeful and comes with clear moral victories. We don't want the Ares version, where violence is messy and traumatizing and leaves everyone it touches fundamentally changed. But here's the truth that the myth of Ares teaches us. Denial doesn't work. Rejection doesn't work. Creating a scapegoat and projecting all our discomfort onto that figure doesn't actually solve anything. The Greeks tried that approach for centuries, and they still ended up with the Peloponnesian War, a conflict so brutal and pointless that it essentially destroyed classical Greek civilization. All their attempts to honor strategic warfare and noble combat didn't save them from descending into the exact kind of chaotic, senseless violence that Ares represented. The only path forward is integration. It's acknowledging that yes, humans are capable of terrible violence. Yes, there's a part of our nature that can be cruel and destructive. Yes, war and conflict have shaped our history and our present, and will likely shape our future. But we don't have to let that part control us. We don't have to worship it or glorify it, and we absolutely cannot afford to simply deny it exists. Think about it in personal terms. Everyone has anger. Everyone has aggressive impulses. Everyone has moments where they feel hurt or threatened and want to strike back. That's the Ares within each of us. Now you have choices about how to handle that. You can deny it, push it down, pretend you're above such base emotions. But denied anger doesn't disappear. It festers, it grows. It eventually explodes in ways that are often more destructive than if you'd acknowledged it from the beginning. Or you can give in to it completely. Let anger and aggression rule your life. Become the person who lashes out at every provocation. That's equally destructive. The healthy path is integration, acknowledging the anger, understanding where it comes from, recognizing it as part of your emotional landscape, but not letting it control your actions. That's what the myth of Ares is really teaching us. Not that war and violence are good, but that denying their reality or projecting our discomfort onto scapegoats doesn't actually help us deal with them. There's a lesser-known myth about Ares that I find deeply moving. After the Trojan War, after all the death and destruction, Ares withdrew from the world of gods and men. He went to Thrace, a wild region north of Greece, and there he simply existed. No grand wars, no dramatic conflicts, just a god, finally at peace, finally not being asked to be something he couldn't be. And in that withdrawal, in that quiet existence, there's a kind of sad dignity. It makes you wonder, what would Ares have been if he'd been loved? If Zeus had looked at his son with pride instead of contempt? If the Greeks had honored him as the Romans later would? Would he have become something different, something more balanced? Or was his nature always going to be what it was, and the only variable was how others responded to him? We'll never know. But I think there's a lesson in the question itself, because the same applies to people. How many individuals shaped by rejection and contempt become the very thing others fear them to be? How many people told they're worthless or dangerous or wrong eventually give up and embody those labels? And conversely, how many people given love and acceptance and integration into community manage to channel even difficult aspects of their nature into something productive? The tragedy of Ares isn't that he was the god of war. The tragedy is that he was never given the chance to be anything else. He was created for a role, rejected for fulfilling that role, and then blamed for the very nature he was given. It's a kind of cosmic injustice that resonates through millennia. And perhaps that's why this myth still matters. Perhaps that's why we should remember Ares not as a simple villain or a one-dimensional embodiment of violence, but as a complex figure who reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and how we deal with the parts of ourselves we'd rather not acknowledge. Every time we go to war claiming it's for noble reasons while ignoring the brutal reality of combat, we're repeating the pattern. Every time we honor the concept of military service while failing to care for veterans, we're repeating the pattern. Every time we consume violence as entertainment but refuse to grapple with its real consequences, we're repeating the pattern. The Greeks tried to solve their discomfort with war by creating two gods, Athena for the war they wanted to believe in, and Ares for the war they wanted to deny. But splitting the concept didn't make the reality any less harsh. War remained what it always was, regardless of which divine figure they invoked. The only thing their split divine representation achieved was allowing them to feel better about themselves, to maintain the fiction that their wars were different, more justified, more strategic, more noble than the base violence Ares represented. We do the same thing today with different language. We talk about surgical strikes and collateral damage and bringing democracy. We create elaborate justifications and strategic frameworks. We build narratives of good versus evil, of necessary intervention, of protecting our values. And sometimes those narratives are even true. Sometimes conflict is necessary. Sometimes violence is the least bad option. But let's not pretend it's anything other than what it is. Let's not reject the Ares truth in favor of the Athena fiction. Because here's what I've come to believe, after sitting with these myths and thinking about what they mean. The god who never wanted war was Ares himself. That sounds contradictory, I know. How can the god of war not want war? But think about it from his perspective. He was created to embody something terrible. He never chose that role. He never asked to be the repository of humanity's most violent impulses. He was simply born into it, shaped by it, defined by it, and then hated for it. Ares, in his truest form, is every person who's been asked to do violence on behalf of others, and then rejected for what that violence did to them. He's every soldier who comes home changed and finds they no longer fit into the society they fought for. He's every person who's been forced into a role they never wanted and then blamed for fulfilling it. He's the embodiment of what we do to each other when we refuse to acknowledge our own capacity for darkness and instead project it onto convenient scapegoats. And if we could somehow go back and speak to Ares, if we could sit with this god in his lonely retreat in Thrace and ask him what he wanted, I don't think he'd say more war, more violence, more chaos. I think he'd say he wanted what everyone wants, to be understood, to be accepted, to be loved for who he is, rather than hated for what he represents. I think he'd say he wanted peace. The greatest irony of Ares is that the god of war might have been the one figure in the entire pantheon who truly understood war's cost and wished it would end. Because he carried that cost in his very being. Every battle, every death, every act of violence added to the weight he bore. And unlike the other gods, who could distance themselves from war's reality, Ares had to live inside it, embody it, become it. So when we remember Ares now, let's remember him not as a villain, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder that how we treat the uncomfortable parts of reality, the aspects of human nature we'd rather not acknowledge, determines whether we transcend them or are consumed by them. The Greeks tried rejection and projection, and it didn't save them from war. The Romans tried integration and acknowledgement, and while it didn't make them peaceful, it at least allowed them to be honest about what they were and what they did. We're still struggling with the same question 3,000 years later. How do we deal with violence, with aggression, with the capacity for harm that exists in every human heart? Do we deny it? Do we embrace it? Do we find some way to acknowledge it while not being controlled by it? These aren't just abstract philosophical questions. They shape how we build our societies, how we raise our children, how we relate to each other and to the wider world. And perhaps, in the end, the lesson of Ares is simply this: whatever you reject becomes your shadow. Whatever you refuse to acknowledge gains power over you. The only way to truly master something is to first accept that it exists. The Greeks rejected Ares and still ended up drowning in the very violence he represented. We've been making the same mistake ever since, with the same results. Maybe it's time we finally stopped hating the god of war and started understanding what he's been trying to tell us all along. That war is horror, that violence damages everyone it touches, that there's no glory in combat, only survival and loss, and that the first step toward peace is acknowledging, honestly and completely, what war actually is. Not what we wish it would be, not what we tell ourselves it must be, but what it is in its raw, unvarnished, ARES truth reality. Only then, when we stop projecting our discomfort onto convenient scapegoats and start owning our own capacity for violence, can we begin to transcend it. Only then can we find the harmony that Ares and Aphrodite created together, that balance of love and war, beauty and violence that produces something greater than either could alone. Only then can we look at the god who never wanted war and finally understand what he's been showing us across the millennia, that the path to peace runs through acknowledgement, not denial. And so, Ares remains in his retreat, neither fully accepted nor entirely forgotten, waiting for humanity to finally learn the lesson, waiting for us to stop hating him for holding up a mirror to our own nature, waiting for the day when we can look at war honestly, and in that honesty, finally find the courage and wisdom to choose differently. He's been waiting for 3,000 years. The question is, how much longer will we make him wait?